and he's a wise man. But what are his problems? He has an expensive plant that he has to maintain. Not only a church building, but a parish hall. Very modern. And he has to be sure that there are enough people in the community who annually pledge so much money to maintain this operation. And therefore he's interested in upholding the building. And yet he knows in his own heart that that's not the way things should work. So then, I've often wanted to preach a sermon at the laying of the foundation stone of a church, where the stone is ceremoniously laid, and I will take as my text from the Gospel of St. Matthew. If a man's son ask him bread, will he give him a stone? The answer is yes. You will find again and again that if you want to raise money for a project, you can far more easily raise money for the erection of a building than you can for the support of living people in their work as scholars or priests or physicians or psychiatrists or whatever it may be that they do. You can't get money for people. You can get money for buildings. And so the priest then has to say, we must destroy the church, burn the buildings down, deny all the doctrines, because the whole symbolism is that it was by the breaking of the body of Christ that the salvation of the world was delivered. When Jesus predicted his own death to his disciples, they were scandalized. And they said, but it is written in the tradition that the Messiah is not subject to death. This is in the Gospel of St. John. And Jesus replied, if a grain of corn does not fall into the ground and die, it remains lifeless and isolated, but if it dies, it brings forth much fruit. So therefore, it is only through letting go of the process of clinging to life, which is all our fixation on immortality, on preserving the valuable things, etc., this huge anxiety that we hold on. So he was saying, let it go. So then, when the priest celebrates Mass, what happens? What is it? To understand this, we have to go back to the very meaning of the Mass. In the civilization of the ancient Near East, the Mediterranean world, the staple food was bread from wheat, and the staple drink was wine. You didn't, if you were in your right mind, drink water, because it was polluted. And therefore an alcoholic content in the water was a safeguard against infection. So they had a way of making wine, not quite like our wine today. It was a very thick mixture. It was like concentrated port. And they served at table what is called a krater, from which we get our word crater, which was a shallow bowl-like cup. And they poured wine into this and they mixed it with water. And this was the staple drink, as today children in Greece, in France, always drink wine. They don't consider it alcoholic luxury. They consider it food. So then, in this state of civilization, bread and wine were the staple food and drink. Now, bread is made from crushed wheat, and wine is made from crushed grapes. So there's an idea of sacrifice, that the life of the wheat and the life of the grapes is sacrificed that we may live. And therefore Jesus identified himself with this sacrifice, with the universal process of biology, whereby all biological beings live in a mutual eating society, and we are only sustained by feeding on other forms of life. But he switched it. Instead of saying, this is a situation in which we are predators, and we clobber these other forms of life, and alas, he put himself in the position of everything clobbered and said, I am all those creatures that you destroy and eat. Therefore, taking the bread, this is my body which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. And then taking the cup, this is my blood of the New Testament. That is to say, the New Testament means relationship, really. Diatheke in Greek. The new dialogue, the new interchange between man and reality. And the New Testament is that it's not that you clobber the world and feel terribly guilty because you've eaten fish and cows and wheat, but that I, God, give myself to you through the wheat, through the grapes, through the cows. So the blood is shed for you for the remission of sins. In other words, please take this offering and don't feel guilty about it anymore. Because I, in the form of the victims, give myself to you voluntarily. So then, the idea of the Mass, of Holy Communion, or whatever you want to call it, is the breaking of the bread and the crushing of the grapes. That through the sacrificial act, the destroying act, life is given. Therefore, when a priest repeats the sacrifice, and at the altar he takes the bread in the form of the host and breaks it, and pours out the blood, pours out the wine, all that becomes merely ridiculous symbolism if he is not also ready to break up the church. That means to knock down the idols, first of all, that is to say, the dogmas upon which people rely and lean, suddenly discover the death of God, you see, suddenly discover the historical Jesus is something you can't put your finger on. Maybe the resurrection didn't happen. There was nothing to cling to. No miracles possible, perhaps. Break it up. And above all, break up the organization, which is a political institution with enormous property holdings, generally exploiting the public. Then on those conditions, if the clergy, if the ministry were so to break up the church would come to life. It would become a significant institution again, which it now is not. So, the next thing is this. There's another aspect to the breaking up of the church. I spent some time this morning on going through the political analogy of the kingdom of God. God as the big boss whom everyone must obey. Now, there are two themes in Christianity, one of which is political and the other of which is organic. The political image is the kingdom of God. The organic image is the body of Christ, or the symbolism of the vine. I am the vine and you are the branches. Indeed, one of the most extraordinary books in the Bible, that love poem called the Song of Songs, has a theme of a love relationship between the creator and the creature, in which all the imagery is vegetative as distinct from urbane. So a transformation of the church from the political urbane institution to the vegetative organic institution, where the image of the government, or not the government, let me say the order of the world, changes from that of the polis, the city, the kingdom, to that of the vine and the body, the organism. This is the inner meaning of the incarnation, of the union of God and man. While God and man are not truly united, then order must be imposed from above. When God and man are truly united, in the spirit of the prophet Jeremiah, who said, "No more shall everyone teach his brother, saying, 'Know God,' but they shall all know me, for I will write my law in their hearts." And the law written in the heart, you see, is entirely different from the law imposed from above. The law written in the heart means what comes naturally. Now, Jesus was a very clever guru. And in order to get people to have the law come naturally, he parodied the law imposed. And he did this in the Gospel of St. Matthew, which is never read correctly. You know how it begins with the Beatitudes. And when he says, "Blessed are the pure in heart," makairos in Greek means happy, not blessed in the sort of unctuous sense which that word has in English. It means happy, makairos. Are the pure. It doesn't mean the people who don't tell dirty jokes. Pure means clear, transparent, hip, aware, unhung up. See? Now he then does a very strange thing. He says, "I have not come to destroy the law and the prophets." Not to destroy, but to fulfill. For I tell you that not one ornamental serif or punctuation mark shall be taken away from the law until the end of the world. Therefore, you've got to obey all those forms. The scribes and the Pharisees pride themselves because they obey the law very thoroughly. But you must be more righteous than they are. Unless your righteousness exceed the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will not be able to enter into the kingdom of heaven. So, to underline this and exemplify it, you have heard it said of old time, there are a series now of crimes. One is to be angry with your brother. Another crime is to call him something that would correspond to our way of saying to a person, "You bastard." Another way would correspond to our way of saying to someone, "You're a fool." Now, obviously, to be very angry is the major crime. So what he does is he reverses the order of courts. We might say we have a magistrate's court, or let's say we have the Marin County courts in San Rafael, we have the state of California superior courts in San Francisco, and we have the federal courts leading up to the Supreme Court. See? Now, what he does is the funny thing. He switches the order. For the major crime, which is being really angry, he assigns you to the lowest court. For the minor crime, which is calling someone a fool, he assigns you to the major court, which is hellfire, Gehenna. And then if you keep reading on in the gospel, you know, everybody reads in the King James Bible, "Whoever says, 'Thou fool,' shall be in danger of hellfire." And because instead of using quotation marks, it uses a capital letter for the beginning of what would ordinarily be in quotes, people think that saying "thou fool" means calling God a fool. It doesn't mean that at all. It means, if you read it in Greek, moire, in the vocative, means fool. Saying to your brother, "Fool, you shall be in danger of hellfire." But later on in the same gospel, he addresses the whole crowd and uses the same expression in the plural. "Moroi, you fools and blind, following blind guides." You see, he doesn't even obey his own precept. So his precept must be taken ironically. He's a humorist here. He's saying, you Pharisees, you think you're so great because you obey the law. Now look, I'm going to give you a law, and you obey that. In other words, it's the technique of reductio ad absurdum, because what does he do next? He says, you've heard it said of old time that you shall not commit adultery. Ha ha. But I tell you that anybody who looks at a woman to lust after her has already committed adultery in his heart. And so all these pious fakes think, oh, we shouldn't have lustful thoughts about women. That's awful. Who doesn't have lustful thoughts about women? You don't always have to act them out. So then he goes on with this joke. Therefore, if your eye offends you, you looked at that girl and kind of think, pluck it out. It's better for you that you enter into the kingdom of heaven with one eye, rather than have to go into hell with two eyes. Really, these ministers, these theologians have absolutely no humor at all. Well, the whole thing is a joke. So likewise, your adversary meets you and wants to take away your coat. Well, give him your cloak also. If you're going to be... So he says, God is absolute perfection, makes his sun to shine on the evil, on the good, and sends his rain on the just and on the unjust. You do the same thing. Well, nobody can. Can you love your enemies? Can you take no thought for the morrow? Can you be as carefree as the birds and the bees? See, can you really sincerely love God and your neighbor with all your heart, with all your soul and all your mind? Who can? See? Here's the thing he's doing. He challenges, he throws this whole thing at you as a koan, pretending it's a commandment. And everybody in Christianity has tried sincerely to obey these things, except that every minister gives up on the take no thought for the morrow bit and says it's not practical. Why? So the meaning of it is you shall love God. You shall love your neighbor. And no faking, please. That is a fake commandment. It's a test. It's a reductio ad absurdum of the whole idea of law, of enforced goodness, because one must obey out of the fear of divine power. Because if you obey out of the fear of divine power, your actions are not significantly moral. Your actions are significantly moral only if they are done out of love. And love would not be motivated by fear. How are we to love? You can't love. Possibly, not possibly, while you still think you're an ego. While you still think you're separate from other people and the rest of the world. You can't love at all. How then are you overcome being an ego? Why? Obviously, you can only overcome it if you in some experimental way find out that the ego is a delusion. So therefore, Jesus proposes, as a way of finding out that your ego is an illusion, that you live up to these ideals. Now, I can go on further. I don't know if anybody reads the Bible anymore, whether this means anything to you. But St. Paul, in the Epistle to the Romans, has an argument which is very clever. He says that God did not give Moses the law with the expectation that it would be obeyed. Indeed, he says, I learned sin through the law. I had not known covetousness except the law had said, thou shalt not covet. Then he poses this funny problem. shall we then sin that grace may abound? He says, oh, no, heaven forbid. Mithi genito. Huh? But he says, now look, the reason why God gave the law was to convict us of sin. It was not in the expectation that the law would be obeyed, but only to show us how far short we fell of the divine life. So exactly the same reasoning must therefore apply to the precepts of Jesus. Not given in the expectation that they would be obeyed, but in the expectation that through trying to obey them, we would discover that we were in a mess of some kind, that we couldn't obey them. Well, why not? Why can't you do it? Why can't you love? Really, genuinely, completely. The answer is you're hung up on the idea that you are a separate ego, cut off, alone. You really believe you're that. So let's test this ego out by trying to get it to do this and trying to get it to do that, all those things it's supposed to be capable of doing. You discover that you're not capable of doing them. And the reason you're not capable of doing them is that you as a separate individual don't exist. You're a hallucination in that sense. And that's what has to be discovered. And you can't find that out by just telling people that it's so. They won't believe it. You can only dissolve an illusion by getting people to act on it as if it were true, and act on it consistently, persistently, and thoroughly. When it all falls apart, it doesn't work. So in this way, Jesus is using a guru technique, where like a Zen master gives a koan. What is the sound of one hand? Who are you authentically and genuinely before your father and mother conceived you? Show me. In other words, act perfectly sincerely, without any social conditioning, what your parents told you you were, etc., etc., etc. Nobody can do it. Why can't they do it? Because there's no authentic, separate you. And when you find that out, naturally, you know that what you really are is you're one with the universe. Like Jesus would say, I and the Father are one. Before Abraham was, I am. I am the way, the truth, and the life. That's what you really are. Only then the whole Christian church managed to circumvent this and shut it up. It was too true to be good. And they said, oh yeah, only Jesus was the way, the truth, and the life. Not you, baby. Not you, not you. But in a way, that's put such a burden on Western man. And it's taken just under 2,000 years to see through it. And the change is coming. See? Everybody's beginning to realize what the whole trick was about. Jesus, you see, was an individual who got enlightened. Only he was in the context of the Hebrew world, and he had the puzzle of how to express his state of consciousness in terms of his own time. He couldn't very well come out and say directly, I've just discovered that I'm the Lord God. Not in a context of Jewish theology, because of the political imagery. If he said in the context of Jewish theology, I am the Lord God, that would have been like saying, you all should bow down and worship me. When some people, including many of his disciples, caught on that he was indeed the Lord God, that was their response, you see. They bowed down and worshipped him when he tried to turn them off that, saying, why do you call me good? There is none good but God. and why he insistently prevented them from the political involvement, which was that if he was truly the Son of God, which means simply son of, means of the nature of, why didn't he lead the revolution against the Roman Empire? And he threw all that aside as a temptation, in exactly the same way as the Buddha threw aside all magical powers and said, that's a sidetrack. That doesn't lead to understanding. When the Buddha was walking along a stream one day, there was a yogi who suddenly started walking across the water because of his miraculous powers. And the Buddha said to him, hey, come back. There's a ford just 50 yards up the river. So in the same way, Jesus would not give signs of divine dominance to those who asked for them. But the church, in later times, you see, has put him on a pedestal so that the whole doctrine is rendered ineffective, just like that. And has tried to insist that these commandments, you must love God, you must take no thought for the morrow, is tried equivocally at that to say, these are commandments. And you ought to feel terribly guilty because you don't love God with all your heart. You do take thought for the morrow. You don't really trust in God. And for 2,000 years it's taken to realize that maybe Jesus had a sense of humor. It was ironical. Was trying to get his students, disciples, to realize they were just as much incarnations of God as he was. Because he said, when the Jews took up stones to stone him, this again in the Gospel of St. John, and he said, many good works I have shown you. For what do you stone me? And they said, we don't stone you for a good work, but for blasphemy. Because you, being a man, make yourself God. And he replied, is it not written in your law, quote, I have said you are gods? And he's quoting the 83rd Psalm, where it says, you are gods and the children of the Most High, but you shall die like men. So he said, if I say, I am a son of God, which means, son of in Hebrew, or in Arabic, it means of the nature of. When you say, we say, you're a son of a bitch, it means you're bitchy. So when they say Ebony Kelb, which means son of a dog, Ebony El Homa, son of a donkey, or son of Belial, they mean of the nature of. So son of God means like son of a bitch, only the opposite way. You're divine. It had nothing to do with paternity. It's simply an expression. So when he said, if I say I am a son of God, and in the King James translation it's all loused up by calling I am the son of God, which is not in the original Greek. He says simply, I am a son of God, so are you. Only you can't realize this, that you're a son of God, while you're still hooked up on the idea of legal righteousness, that you can, by the effort of your own separate conscious will, do the divine acts. You have to let go of yourself. You have to abandon that situation before you can be enthused, transformed, and inflamed with the divine spirit. So what he does throughout that whole Sermon on the Mount, then, is to make a caricature of legal righteousness. One of the funniest ways in which he did this was in the parable of the Pharisee and the publican. This was most ingenious. He tells a story, you see, of the Pharisee goes into the temple, goes straight up to the front seat, stands up before the altar and says, "Oh God, I am not as other men are. I've paid my tithes regularly. I have fulfilled this obligation. I have fulfilled that obligation, and I'm feeling very good about it." You know, just like the senior warden of the vestry in the Episcopal Church, or a Knight of Columbus. And then he says this publican, who's a disreputable character, creeps into the back of the synagogue, beats himself on the breast and says, "God be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you that that man went down to his house justified rather than the Pharisee." Now what happened? Everybody tries to imitate the publican. Now the Pharisees creep into the back of the church, beat themselves on the breast and say, "God be merciful to me, a sinner," because they think that's the way to do it. Now you see, telling that story has an effect. It has taken away the possibility of being the genuine publican as distinct from the phony Pharisee, because now the moment you're trying to be genuine, you're being phony. And I don't know, I've never seen anybody except, I think, Grodek, whose writing on this showed me the idea, who saw through what a subtle teacher Jesus was. But you have to read between the lines. You have to get the humor of it. You have to get all the plays that are going on in this, because he's fully aware of the effect that his stories have on his audience. Well, they didn't know what to do with it. They just had to get rid of it. First of all, the problem of the death of God theology, and secondly, the problem of whether the Jewish and Christian traditions can be in some way revived. Today, I'm going to talk about the future of religion in the first session from a social point of view, and in this afternoon's session from an individual point of view. And what we are going to look at is a rather strange idea, which Frederick Spiegelberg, who has taught the history of religions at Stanford for many years, calls the religion of no religion. A curious thing that has many aspects to it. He wrote a very interesting book about it years ago, which has unfortunately sort of disappeared from the market. I met Spiegelberg in 1936 originally as a refugee from Hitler in England. And he had just come out with the idea of the religion of no religion, and it immediately struck a responsive chord in me because I was involved with the study of Zen, which in a way is the religion of no religion. In Zen, for example, a famous story tells of one of the monks who was pestering his teacher as to how he was making progress in his study of Zen. And the teacher said, "You're all right, but you have a trivial fault." "And what is that?" He said, "You have too much Zen." Well, the student said, "Don't you take it for granted that a person who is studying Zen would be interested in it, thinking about it, talking about it?" And he said, the teacher said, "No, it turns one's stomach." So another monk who was standing by said, "Well, why is this?" He said, "When it's like an ordinary everyday conversation, it's much better." And so it has been a principle of Zen throughout its whole history that if somebody asks you a religious question,
you give a secular answer. What is the ultimate meaning of Buddhism? There's enough breeze in this fan to keep me cool. Or if somebody says, why do you have a fan? The answer is, see, that's a secular question. So the answer is, this fan will ascend to the 15th heaven and hit the nose of the presiding deity. The answer is sacred. There is a Latin saying from the poet Lucretius, tantum religio potuit suadere malorum. Too much religion is apt to encourage evil. And so somehow, always, I'm suspicious of religious people. When somebody comes on with a great spiel about idealism and what you ought to do and this and that, I know he's a rascal. But when I meet somebody who from the very beginning of our association admits that he's a rascal, I feel safer. And that's the reason why when men are friendly with each other, I don't know about women, because that's their private world and I'm not privy to it. But men who are fond of each other call each other's bastards and all sorts of uncomplimentary names. Hey, you old son of a bitch, how are you doing? See? That means that we recognize that we have in common something which in Hebrew theology is called the Yetzer Hara. This word in Hebrew means the wayward spirit. And it, according to Hebrew theology, when God created Adam in the beginning of time, he put in his heart the Yetzer Hara. And that was, in other words, a predisposition to be ornery, to be difficult, to be non-cooperative, to go off on his own in some way. Christians don't admit this. They have no doctrine of the Yetzer Hara, which is why Hebrews have more humor in religion than Christians do. There are some exceptions to this. For example, G.K. Chesterton, a great Catholic, had wonderful humor, and some Catholics have this. But by and large, the Christian religion is serious. But the Hebrew religion has always a slight twinkle to it. If you see a play like The Fiddler on the Roof, the Hebrew can talk to God on a kind of a man-to-man basis. But the Christian is always cowering, fundamentally. Too big a load of guilt because of not admitting, not realizing that it was God himself who was responsible for the waywardness of human nature, for the Yetzer Hara. I call the Yetzer Hara, in the English translation, the element of irreducible rascality that is in us all. And Jung spoke of this a great deal when he called, when he addressed himself to the problem of the assimilation of the evil in us. Once upon a time, Jung met a man in whom he could find no human failing whatsoever. And this man seriously disturbed him. He said, I have at last met a genuine saint. And he was so worried that he thought that he should take his own life in order and reform himself. He said, a few days later, I met the man's wife. And never again have I been subject to this temptation. Not because his wife was the sort of person who said, well, you should try and live with my husband. That wasn't the idea at all. It was that his wife contained the saint's shadow side. He drove her to desperation because she had to reflect all the repressed things in her husband. So Jung saw through it and never again was tempted to be a saint. I have a most amusing friend who lives with me here on this boat, the artist Jean Varda. And he is always in danger of being beguiled by saints. Someone comes around who he is sure is a completely saintly person, and then suddenly there's a frightful disillusionment. It always turns out that it wasn't that way at all. So one has to be very suspicious of all pretensions to goodness and to sanctity, because they do not recognize the Yetzer Hara, or the element of irreducible rascality that is in us all. And this then is why preaching, a preached religion, is a failure. The whole lesson of history is that preaching doesn't work. That preaching is really a form of moral violence, of trying to change human conduct by saying, look, if you don't mend your ways, there's going to be a terrible thing happen. Either the police are going to catch you, or hellfire, which is of course the celestial police force, is going to catch you, or a dreadful doom is going to occur. You realize that before the Second World War, beginning with Remarque's book, All Quiet on the Western Front, there was an enormous propaganda against war based on the horrors of war. And in Japan, they had innumerable movies taken during the First World War, which was an unbelievably brutal Holocaust, where those British and French generals really sacrificed men. Do you know that on the day that the armistice was declared and the victory was announced for the Allied forces, when the commanding officers ordered 3 cheers for His Majesty the King, a great many of the men blew raspberries instead. It was an absolutely inhuman thing. Well, the Japanese had all these very uncensored photographs and movies, but this did not deter the Japanese from trying it themselves. Because horror, the doom, has a fascination for everybody. The same thing, kind of vertigo, which one gets looking over a precipice, the temptation to jump. I know a young man, I did know him, he's dead. He had tried everything. He had tried all possible changes of consciousness, all possible drugs and experiments. And finally, he did something to die, and I am sure I know why. He had to find out what death was about. He'd found out everything else, but he was completely fascinated. And so always, when you paint the picture of doom, and say, this is what's going to happen to you if, you are simply asking for trouble. People will go to their doom. And so the preaching lesson is no good. The only way to change human behavior is to woo instead of preach, to make love instead of threatening disaster, to point out how glorious something could be, and in some way to live it. And this is the real, if it has any meaning and if it has any guts to it, the idea of make love, not war, would be to live here and now, starting today, a magnificent life. And you don't need a great deal of money to do it. You need more imagination than money. I know innumerable people who've got lots and lots of money and who are absolutely miserable because they have no imagination. And they are full of fears because of their wealth. They always think someone's going to take it away, and instead of now, will I starve, will I get sick? Because there's no protection against that. Who knows when anything strikes, when any accident strikes? We have no real defense against that. So from a social point of view, the important thing in religion is no longer preaching the possibility of doom, because nobody is threatened by doom. Doom doesn't deter anyone, because we know we're all doomed anyway. Why rub it in? We're all going to die. And of course the Christians and the Islamic peoples, and to some extent the Hindus and Buddhists, try to rub it in and say, you think death is the bad thing. Here, you just wait till when you're dead, because we've got eons of time in which you can be tortured in our very special hells. Stop and consider that. Well, everybody read about it. It's like people think about the atom bomb. Nobody is any more deterred by thinking about that. We're so used to it. And at the same time, it's inconceivable. Is there nothing anyone can do about it? There's no way of defending San Francisco against an atomic attack. So therefore, everybody stops thinking about it, because it's insoluble. So the terror thing does nothing. If anything at all, we would say, okay, let's get it over with, so we don't have to dread this anymore. Push the button and end it. So what is necessary to do instead, and not for any reason that there might be death and hell at last, but to get up the nerve to live the joyous, good life today, using imagination rather than money. And the difficulty for Jews and Christians, in particular, other people have difficulties too, but the difficulty for them is the feeling that if you do presume to live the good life today, you will make the gods mad. It's like saying to people, you may well laugh now, but you just wait. What's going to happen to you? So then, we have, you see, an enormous terror of pleasure, of enjoying ourselves. Because when we enjoy ourselves, we feel guilty. We know, I mean, if you eat a good dinner, there's an obscure feeling that somebody somewhere is not having a good dinner. Therefore, what right have you to enjoy your dinner when there's somebody going hungry? Well, what are you going to do about that? If it just gives you a bad digestion because you can't assimilate your own dinner, that does no one any good. It doesn't do the hungry person any good. It doesn't do you any good. Guilt, in other words, is an absolutely 100% destructive emotion. And one of the real reasons why people don't do anything about the hungry, and something could be done about it, is their guilt hang-up. They'd rather be guilty than practical. It's perfectly possible to abolish starvation throughout the world. If people would spend as much energy doing that as they would do motivated by groundless fears, getting together to cooperate to defend themselves against the unspeakable threat of yellow communism or something like that. It's to me absolutely unbelievable, the wealth that is wasted and poured into projects of violence, when any practical person would have seen that for half the cost you could have everybody in Asia, all the millions of Chinese, Vietnamese, Hindus, living a nice, prosperous life for half the cost of what it is taking to defend ourselves against the alleged menace. But it is curious, you see, that people will be united for reasons of terror, and not for reasons of love. And yet, the union, the associations they form to defend themselves against an alleged terror are in the end always and invariably destructive. They solve nothing and build up massive historical hatreds. So, if there is to be any sort of future for religion, it's one of the most obvious lessons of history that it must stop preaching and do something else. I was a minister in the Episcopal Church. I was a university chaplain at Northwestern for 5 years. And finally, when I got through with it, the thing that embarrassed me most of all was preaching. You see, the problem of being a minister, you have your collar turned around, so on, is that once you set yourself up in that position, people look at you and say, they start respecting you. Cops don't give you tickets. They give you a discount at the liquor store. You get all these funny little privileges. And why? Well, people would say, you're living vicariously for us the good life that we don't live. See? Now, what does that mean? It means essentially this, that you don't screw around. That's all. And that's all. Because if you take the practical test, what do the churches do socially today? They are not interested in anything. They're not interested in mysticism. They're not interested in God. They're not interested in abolishing poverty. A few of them are. The Quakers, a few people get mad about war and really try to do something. But by and large, all that churches are doing is they are family and sexual regulation societies. And the truth of the matter is the test. For what can a preacher get kicked out? For owning shares in an armaments corporation, General Dynamics? Not on your life. You can live, as I say, quoting the litany of the Church of England, in a state of envy, hatred, malice, and all uncharitableness, hardness of heart and contempt of God's word and commandment, and be a bishop in good standing. But the minute you sleep with your secretary, you're out. That's the test. And after all, even sleeping with somebody in an irregular way is a loving thing to do. It's not a hateful thing to do. It's an action of affection. However, whatever rationalization you may bring forth to show that it shouldn't be done, Jesus certainly regarded it as one of the minor sins and was far more angered by the money changers in the courts of the temple than he was about the woman taken in the sin of adultery. And yet this is magnified. This is the thing. So this whole position of a religion geared to repression, essentially what it is. Freud was right, but Freud didn't have the courage of his convictions. This is why Norman Brown's book, Life Against Death, is such a marvelous piece of work. Because here you get a very sophisticated classical scholar putting forward the preposterous notion that repression is a bad thing. And he's advocating it with all the historical knowledge and literary expertise of a professor of his standing. It's very funny indeed. But insofar then as our religion has been repressive, it has one thing to be said for it. And the moment you understand this, the bubble is broken. The one thing that can be said for repression is the tighter the squeeze, the stronger the jet. And so, in a way, sex has been made more exciting by making it forbidden. But that's the purpose. In other words, if we go back to the origins of Christianity in Rome, the civilization of Rome, where, depending on your social level, you had different kinds of sex life. If you were rich enough to attend the baths, you could have anything you wanted. Plenty of it. If you weren't rich enough to go to the baths, you had the circus. And in the circus, you could be entertained with any kind of sadism, masochism, weird bestialities and goings-on. Finally, everybody got sexually flaccid. And therefore, the revolution of Christianity, to stop all this, with eventually a disgust for sex, was a biological process. However rationalized theologically, it was a biological process to restore sexual interest by making it forbidden. Only they didn't know it. But once you see that, you see, you can see what Christianity did, what its function was, but also you can see that it went too far. Instead of simply recreating interest in sex by making it forbidden, it warped all sorts of people's lives because they didn't have any sexual delight without guilt at all, and it created what is called leather sex, which is a sadomasochistic women in black boots and all that kind of thing. And that's, again, where love, through its frustration, turns into violence, and where orgasm is confused with pain. There's always that possibility, you see, of we are getting our wires crossed. For example, many people who've got their wires crossed in their heads, when they see something that excites sexual excitement, they feel the emotion or the sensation of disgust, because they can't distinguish the nauseating feeling of I want to vomit. They can't clearly distinguish that from the orgiastic feeling of I want to convulse. They've got their wires crossed. So they feel disgust when they should be feeling lust. That's what we call being mixed up. So then, from a social point of view, it seems to me obvious that a social community must have a religion. And above all, a religion about which we all agree. There's no point in having a religion about which we don't agree. I mean, you know, you have the Baptist Church, the Episcopal Church, the Roman Catholic Church, the synagogue, Jehovah's Witnesses, and all these people fighting with each other and playing their various one-upmanship games with each other, and the vast majority of the public who couldn't care less, don't go anyway. So there is no religion today. We've got all these survivals from the past, and they fight with each other. To belong to a religion today is, to my mind, not intellectually respectable. Because all you do when you join a church, you become a divisive force. This is where Krishnamurti is so clear and marvelous in his discussion of this problem. He shows again and again, he asks people, you want to believe in a God, You want to believe in a life beyond death. Why? Why really do you want to believe this? And he drums it in and drums it in. He says the reason is you want to protect yourself. And so long as you're trying to protect yourself, you have put up a shell between you and everything you define as not being you. And for this reason, then, all your beliefs are simply sources of strife and disharmony. And then he puts himself in a very odd position. Because you can't be a disciple of Krishnamurti. You can't join anything. He has no organization. And so he's surrounded with non-disciples. And he gets terribly frustrated because he keeps seeing that the people who follow him and who come and listen to him, they just don't understand what he's trying to get across. The smart people would leave, you know. They would get the word and disappear. How fast can you get out? But they think that there's still some special secret he's got up his sleeve, and if they hang around long enough, they'll get it. Well, they won't. He's said everything right from the start. So then we cannot, or much as there is need for a religion in society, a religion which believes in something won't work. Because the moment you put out a belief, people start to argue. The moment you lay down a law, people start to argue. Should it be this way? Should it be that way? And then there's this group that says, we think it should be this, that you should eat meat. And the other group says, no, you shouldn't eat meat. And so they start yammering at each other. So there is a possibility then that there could be an entirely different basis of religion. Let's think of some things that we agree about and don't argue about. There's a pretty close agreement among people living in the United States of whatever racial origin to speak the English language, because no one enforces it. People don't go around saying, you will be damned forever if you split an infinitive, or if you use the word baluka instead of cup. Nobody fights about that. Therefore, more or less everybody agrees to talk English. It's convenient. Another thing that we don't fight much about is music. There are indeed some parties in music. There are people, the classical people, there are the rock people, there are the jazz people, there are the barbershop quartet people. But there's a pretty easy tolerance about this. We don't really take people to law and get the cops after them because they differ in musical tastes from us. Say, oh, well, there's plenty of room. Now, music is something, therefore, about which people can unite with no argument. What is there to argue about? You just get with it and you swing. So then, this indicates to me that the only possibly harmonious religion for mankind could be one which has in it no ideology. It would have no doctrines. So there would be nothing to argue about. In the principle of Zen is always, of course, instead of theorizing about what is the nature of the universe, to point directly and say, if you want to understand, see into it directly. In other words, here I am talking. Anyway, look into the nature of life without thinking. And see for yourself that when you don't think, you don't make any division between yourself and the rest of the world. You cannot point to the distinction between your 5 fingers. You can't lay your finger on the difference between your fingers. And in the same way, you cannot touch the difference between yourself and someone else. The difference is a concept, a propriety, a churlish propriety at that. This is mine, this is yours. Yeah. That's it. But when you stop the theorizing, you stop the thinking, then you don't divide. Then the world is what Buddhists call in its state of suchness, just like that. So then, it is for this reason that if there were to be a religion about which people could really unite, it would have to have no doctrine, no law that is put in words. But people could unite around what we might at the moment call a nonsense religion. I call it HUM, H-U-M, which is the religion that is starting, has no hierarchy. Nobody's in charge. There are no officers, no organization. It has no doctrine. It doesn't say any words that mean anything. It has only music and ritual. Because people like to get together and dance. According to the Hindus, the whole universe is the dance of the Godhead. So join in, get with it. And so this is what we need in American life in particular. We don't have any joyous social assemblage. Figure that, we don't. You may occasionally go to a night spot at a price to dance on a small, little tiny floor, and this is really not much fun. There is no dancing in the streets. Why, it would be considered somehow subversive. There is no pageantry except occasional military pageantry on the 4th of July. There is absolutely no occasion upon which anyone and everyone, as people who live on this geographical expression called the United States, there is no occasion on which we get together for a kind of ritual of mutual agreement and love and so on. It doesn't exist. That's what the rites of a religion were supposed to be. They were the orgies. We think now we misuse the word orgy. We think orgy means simply when all the sexual rules are suspended and you do anything you like. That's because we've made such a big repression out of sex. The real meaning of the orgy, it goes back to the idea that God created the world in 6 days and then took the 7th day off. That's the holiday, which means holy day. So we have the Sabbath for the Jews and the Sunday for the Christians. But what do they don't take a day off? They don't really celebrate. When I was a minister, I used to tell the students at Northwestern University, now, so we're going to be a celebration of the Holy Communion, 7 o'clock next Sunday, 11 o'clock. And I said, now look, I said celebration. And if you come here because you think you ought to come, we don't want you. Better stay in bed, go for a swim or something else. But if you want to join with us in this act of celestial whoopee, you're very welcome. I came right out and said that, you see. So I had to leave the church. This is the essential thing that we lack. We just don't have this social institution. And it's, we would find each other out. For example, let me tell you this story. There was once a retreat meeting for Christians of many different denominations for a discussion of how they could get together. Well, the first time they held this meeting, they talked and they all argued. And it was nothing came of it. So they decided to do it different the next way. They would spend the first day of the conference in total silence, which they did. And then the following meeting, they really got to understand each other, because they associated together in a non-verbal, non-discursive way to begin with no ideology, no theories. And then they could at last see each other as living human beings and expressions of the divine nature, etc., and know it instead of merely think it. So what we should do, if we want to get together the various discordant religions and races and whatsoever, is suspend all discussions. And meet in a strictly physical, earthy way, and realize that what is the very earthy, what is the very physical, is after all not different from, not separate from the spiritual. This is the terrible hang-up of Western man, this distinction of the physical and the spiritual. They're the same. One might say that the spiritual is more concrete than matter. Now that's a kind of a tricky, paradoxical saying, and mystics are always putting out tricky, paradoxical sayings. But a paradox is a truth standing on its head to attract attention.